long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is economist Jeffrey Sachs, university professor and director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University. He's also director of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network and has been an advisor to 3 UN Secretaries General. In addition to being one of the world's leading experts on poverty and economic development, Dr. Sachs is the author of many influential best-selling books, including The Age of Sustainable Development, The Price of Civilization, Building the New American Economy, and, most recently, The Ages of Globalization, which we'll be talking about today. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you. Thank you so much.
You know, in the book, you focus on these 7 ages of globalization, going all the way back to the beginning of humanity and ending in our present time. And you argue that each of these eras offers important lessons about the challenges of globalization today. And so I thought we could start at the very beginning, the Paleolithic age from around 70,000 to 10,000 BCE. And I got to say, starting out, I never would have conceived of this as an age of globalization. I think of, small local tribes and that sort of thing. So the first question, I guess, that myself and probably a lot of listeners would have is, how is this an age of globalization, and what possible relevance could something from that long ago have for the 21st century?
Well, the first age, this Paleolithic or pre-agriculture age, is literally the age in which humanity reached all parts of the world, starting in Africa, spreading out across the Red Sea into what is now called the Arabian Peninsula, and then along the Indian Ocean, later into Europe, reaching, of course, the Americas around 10 to 15,000 years ago, coming from Asia over the landmass we call Beringia, and also reaching Australia and the Polynesian Islands. It's an extraordinary story of reaching the whole world, and evidence of, even then, trade of objects, of stone tools that are nowhere close to where they must have come from, given the geology, given the resources, and obviously were carried long distances and already part of international trade and international exchange. It's also, of course, part of the very formation of our human nature. As one of my gurus, the great evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson of Harvard University, says about our strange time that we live in today. He says we've arrived at the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our medieval institutions, and our near godlike technologies. But when he refers to the Stone Age emotions, he refers to very fundamental facts of human nature, how we bond with each other, cooperation within groups, fighting between the in-group and the out-group, the size of a band of people that stick together, often considered now to be around 150 as the maximum size, but similar to a workplace division or a club. These are attributes that are core to our human nature, formed in the African savanna tens of thousands of years ago. So the relevance is actually to the very core of what we are as human beings.
And I love that line about the Stone Age emotions and godlike technology, and it's so fitting. In the next period you talk about is the Neolithic age, and we start to see agriculture and sedentism, which is people kind of sticking around in one place. And what struck me in your discussion of this age really is the the importance of geography really comes to the fore, and in it you discuss what's been called the lucky latitudes, and I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what those are and what that means.
Absolutely. For most of human history, that means for most of the 100,000 to 200,000 years of us as a modern species, we were not sedentary. We were not farming, but human beings were hunters and gatherers. So we survived day to day by finding our food or hunting for our food. At the end of the last ice age, at the end of the Pleistocene and the beginning of our geologic epoch called the Holocene, the climate became more favorable. We reached warmer temperatures, the glaciers retreated, and clearly there was a new abundance of foodstuff so that people could remain sedentary and still survive, not having to go out to search, to hunt, and to gather. And from that initial sedentism, which almost surely preceded agriculture, by being in one place at one time, human beings in various parts of the world independently discovered the techniques of agriculture, that they could plant seeds, select for better seeds, improve crop traits, and settle down, as it were, with a higher amount of food. What followed was a higher number of people that followed that food supply, so that as the food supply went up, the population went up. And soon enough, what had been a very, very sparse number of anatomically modern humans started to become tens of millions of human beings now settling into what one could call villages. Everybody essentially farming for survival, but living in groups, living in clans or bands of hundreds. And this created the beginning of politics. It created the beginning of hierarchical structures, because as far as we know, hunter-gatherer societies are much more egalitarian than societies beginning with the age of agriculture. And we can see, of course, the development of metallurgy, of bronze and copper tools and jewelry and artistic creations, the beginnings of proto-alphabets like hieroglyphics, the domestication of farm animals, which is absolutely fundamental for humanity ever since then, and new forms of transport, including sailing vessels that could carry people to islands, even very long distances. So this became the formative age of people settling down, and this, of course, crowded out hunter-gatherers. There are still a few on our planet today, but by and large, settled human populations, settlements that began in a few locations in what became Mesopotamia, in Western Asia, in the Indus River Valley, in the Yellow River and Yangtze River valleys, in China, in parts of the Americas, in what is now Central America, and the Andean region. These became the first focal points of agriculture. From then, populations increased. You asked me about the lucky latitudes. If you look on the globe of where this agriculture took place, it took place in a band of climate that was suitable for agriculture, and typically near major rivers, as I've mentioned, like the Tigris, Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, and so forth. And it took place in locations that weren't too cold and weren't too hot. So by and large, in what we now call the subtropical zones or the temperate regions, not icy cold regions that humans had not really been able to master agriculture in large numbers, and not in the hard tropics near the equator, where life is very difficult for other reasons, and agriculture is often very difficult for other reasons as well. But the disease burden is typically very high because of tropical vector-borne diseases. What emerged is a band of geography, especially in the Europe-Asia part of the world, or Eurasia, roughly between 20 to 25 degrees north latitude to roughly 40 to 45 degrees north latitude, where the villages first developed, early agriculture first developed, and towards the end of this period and the beginning of the next epoch, cities and city-states began to develop. And over a period of thousands of years, this band of area, which reaches from Western Europe on the Atlantic coast, across Western Asia, what we now call Anatolia in Turkey, or parts of the Arabian Peninsula and what is now Iran and Iraq, into Central Asia and into East Asia, culminating on the Pacific in a band of Chinese civilization. These lucky latitudes turned out to have the preponderance of human population, the highest productivity agriculture, the places where most of the early cities developed, and related to all of that, the places where technology developed, and with technology came power, with power came empire. So that lucky latitudes shapes a tremendous amount of human history.
You mentioned China and empire, and one of the things that struck me most, I think, about the look at the previous areas of globalization is the story of China, because it seems like everything, well, not everything, but practically so many things were invented there, including, you could argue, as you do in the book, a large-scale capitalist economics. And then you see at the beginning of the Ocean Age, around 1500 or so, these massive Chinese fleets sailing, and then it just seemed to wither into nothing. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of the rise and, it seems to me, the fall of China in this period.
If you look at the long history of civilizations, especially from around 1000 BC to around 1500 AD, and really if you take from 1000 BC to 2020 AD, our current year and moment in history, there's been a constant interchange between East and West. Globalization means interconnection, and one of the core parts of interconnection, in addition to trade, of course, and movement of people, is the movement of ideas and technologies. And there have been periods in human history where technologies spread from west to east. There have been periods where technology spread from east to west. There have been periods where what we now call the Middle East, the Arab region, was absolutely vital for spreading technologies in both directions. It was the middle of a conveyor of technologies and ideas that went in both directions. And in this regard, China, from already 1000 BC until today, has been highly populous, has been a creative and innovative civilization, and for long stretches of human history has had the technological lead and also been the progenitor of great cultural ideas like Confucianism, which has been so deeply influential in East Asia, but also globally. And for the period from roughly 500 AD, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed, to 1500 AD, when Columbus and Vasco da Gama were the new explorers of a new age of exploration led by Western Europe. During that 1,000 years, China was clearly in the technological lead. So many core technologies of printing with movable type, paper making, paper currency, gunpowder, the compass, and many other fundamental technologies came from China and gradually spread through Western Asia into Europe. And Europe was far behind and was a receiver of these technologies. Then, as you recounted, something very extraordinary took place. It's one of the great puzzles and one of the greatest hinge moments of human history. And that is that China lost its lead. And it's a complicated and endlessly debated story because it's such a fundamental transition in human history, in economics, in ideas, and in technology. But somewhere from 1400 to 1600, the initiative shifted from China to the West. And one of these remarkable moments occurs in the first part of the 15th century, when China had the greatest naval capacity and the greatest fleets the world had ever seen under Admiral Zheng He, who was an admiral for the Ming Emperor, and he took several expeditions throughout the Indian Ocean and reached East Africa, went to several of the great trading outposts of the Indian Ocean. And these voyages lasted until 1433. And then they stopped. And clearly, for a variety of reasons, the emperor and the court decided to stop the naval expeditions. A couple of reasons claimed are that China had to turn its attention to nomadic invaders from the north. Another idea is that Confucian philosophy preached against the commercialism and the sense of needing to make contact with the rest of the world. China was the Middle Kingdom. But the voyages stopped. And when they stopped, China actually dismantled the fleet effectively for a couple of centuries. And at the same time, Europe had the most extraordinary series of events. One was its own development of navigational capacity, led by Henry the Navigator of Portugal, as he championed and was patron of voyages down the west coast of Africa. And then fundamental transformation, Columbus's discovery of the Americas. And with that, it seems the trigger was set, perhaps with one more fundamental change, and that was Gutenberg's printing press in the middle of the 15th century, so that all of this huge change of world outlook could be recorded in books, and books could circulate cheaply and massively and accelerate the new knowledge, rate of change, scientific curiosity, and the rest. So while China closed up, the West opened up almost at the same moment. And one could say that this is the time that West, meaning in this case Western Europe in particular, became the base of new thinking, new ideas, a renaissance, a scientific revolution, a technological revolution. And in fact, the next time East and West really met definitively is when a now wholly dominant power of Western Europe encroached on China in the 19th century. And this is epitomized in the two Opium Wars that begin in 1839, wars by the British Empire attacking the Qing dynasty of China, but with Britain having overwhelming military power because it was now an industrial country and China was not an industrial country. And I always found fascinating that the great creator of modern economic thinking, Adam Smith, wrote in his magnum opus, The Wealth of Nations, in 1776, that China was a prosperous country, but a static country. Hugely populous, very productive, seen in a way as a success. But Adam Smith put really the essence of it by saying, because of, he says, its constitution, its nature of political organization, it is static. It wasn't fully static, of course, there were changes, but it had really absented itself from the dynamism of scientific and technological change, with some exceptions. For example, the arrival of the Jesuits that brought some of the Western knowledge to the court of the emperor. But by and large, when West and East really meet again in the middle of the 19th century, the West is dominant. And there is the story of the modern age, which I think is changing just now as we speak. China is regaining its normal place in history as a leading country with technological sophistication. That's not something unusual. That is the norm of the last 2,000 years. What was abnormal was the strange twist of fate that began in the closing of this fleet in 1433 and really went up to the 20th century.
Yeah, I wanted to actually ask you a little bit more about China, because it seems to me in our modern era, at least to me, the most startling thing is the massive growth of China, and it almost feels to me if like it's sort of like the United States is sort of like Great Britain in the early 20th century, that U.S. is still the top global power, but we see this competitor who looks a lot like us back then coming up, and it feels almost, I don't know, I get a sense of inevitability about it, just given geography and population and that. I mean, is that a reasonable analogy?
Well, I think what is a fundamental part of my own thinking about economics is that all things equal, that's a big loaded expression, all things equal, in a peaceful, interconnected time, places that are lagging behind other places have the opportunity to gradually catch up and converge with those other places. So let me unpack that. China by 1950 was an impoverished country when the People's Republic of China emerged in 1949 after civil war, after many invasions, after many depredations by Western powers, after Japanese occupation. China was impoverished. It was a country of peasants. Technology was a century behind the industrial lead. of the United States and Western Europe. The period of the previous 100 years had really been a kind of hell because there had been the Opium Wars. There was an internal bloody war called the Taiping Rebellion. There were the imperial powers encroaching on China and many wars with Japan, many pressures from the United States, from the British Empire, France, and others. There was civil war, there was upheaval, and then there was the defeat of Japan, the end of a civil war between the Chinese communists and the Chinese nationalists, won by the communists, and the new state declared in 1949. Well, that was one damn thing after another that was a disaster for the Chinese people for more than a century. And it was starting with the People's Republic that this process of convergence could finally begin. The World War was over, and there was a chance now to catch up. And even under Mao Zedong, the first leader, who was an unstable character, China made some basic advances of controlling some communicable diseases and beginning primary education and simplifying the language and the script for widespread literacy. But Mao was a figure of instability also and made dreadful and very cruel mistakes. And when Mao died in 1976, China was in a profound crisis. Then came to power a very pragmatic and very brilliant leader, Deng Xiaoping, in 1978. And with Deng Xiaoping coming to power, China had the real capacity to catch up. But wow, did it move fast? Yeah. Did it make good decisions? Did it build infrastructure dramatically? Yes, it was a one-party rule. Americans are very suspicious of that. But I will say that Deng Xiaoping's China made more rapid, substantive, and real economic advance than we've probably seen any place in history at this kind of scale. The Chinese economy grew at roughly 10% per year for 35 years. When you grow at that rate, every 7 years, the economy doubles in size. 35 years means 5 doublings. 5 doublings means 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, or 32 times increase. That's what China achieved. And by 35 years, roughly into the first decade of our century, the 21st century, China had become an industrial economy. Poverty was being rolled back, and China was gradually increasing its real living standards and ending the desperation. Well, since then, China has continued its technological advance. It's still a poorer country than the United States and Western Europe. It's hard to measure precisely comparisons of economies, but it's something around a third of the U.S. output per capita. But given that it is more than 4 times the U.S. population, that means that China is now a comparable size in the aggregate to the U.S. economy. It's a major trading power. It's a major technological power. I say to the good, for sure, because it means that roughly 20% of humanity living in China, 1.4 billion people, have a better life, a much better life, a longer life expectancy, higher education, banishing poverty, enjoying the benefits of modern technology. Some in America, not a small number, unfortunately, view this as a dire threat. I do not. I view this as convergence of a country catching up after lost time. And in China, the lost time was more than a century of dire lost time and several centuries of really lost opportunities. And so I can only be pleased and impressed by China's accomplishments. And I think that the instinctive reaction of too many American foreign policy strategists and so forth that think this is dangerous or bad is both unfair, and the idea, not just unfair, I think it's a bit nasty that only we should benefit from modern technology, not the rest of the world. I don't believe that. And the idea that it's all somehow evil and against the U.S., I strongly disagree with. I've been going to China every year, often many times a year, since the early 1980s, almost every year. And I just don't see it that way. I am very happy that a great civilization has found its feet, is making advances, and I think is contributing to a betterment of the world. And that's how I think we should view this rather than what is pretty heated propaganda. Especially it's gotten dramatically heated with the COVID epidemic. But I think it's a mistaken view to say everything from China, oh, that's awful, evil, and against us. It's a naive misunderstanding of history to put things that way.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because, of course, in the book, you argue that having a social democratic ethos needs to be a key part of sustainable development in the 21st century. But China is certainly not a democracy, and many people would point to what they believe to be a government cover-up, perhaps abetted, some would argue, by the World Health Organization, and point to that and see, this is why we're right to be concerned about so much power in the hands of a non-democratic, not very transparent country. Well, what do you think about that?
Well, I think first of all, when it comes to the very specifics of COVID-19, I've been looking at this almost every hour of every day for months. I've been tracking down the arguments that this is somehow a deliberate cover-up by China. It just doesn't hold water, that point of view. It's more propaganda than analysis. And I'm sorry to say that our Secretary of State, Pompeo, said, I have overwhelming evidence that this virus was released from a laboratory in China. And I personally, that is Jeffrey Sachs, know scientists who are leaders in virology who say, no way, didn't happen. And so I waited. I wrote also op-eds, said, if you have overwhelming evidence, show it. Of course, well, I shouldn't say of course, I would just say never shown. I don't believe it exists. I believe it was a bluff and propaganda that is part of an ongoing effort by the Trump administration to push hard against China on the more general principle that China's rise is a threat to the United States. So the first point on the specifics of the COVID-19 epidemic, I just don't believe the propaganda, or I treat it as propaganda because I've looked day to day at what has happened. And at the very beginning, I think China was very much caught off guard by an absolutely new virus. But within a short period of time, China identified a new virus, sequenced it, put the sequence online, contacted WHO, contacted the United States, and locked down Wuhan and Hubei province in late January, telling the world, oh my God, this is an emergency. And the United States sadly did not react appropriately for weeks and weeks and weeks after that. So there's no excuse, and it, in my view, is in the first weeks, basically the fog of war, as it were, when you're fighting a new virus that you didn't even know existed, and that is a new virus, and you're trying to identify it and so forth. I just don't buy the conspiracy story. When it comes to the broader question of Chinese governance and our governance and so forth, I would say the following. First, there is no perfect political system. And our philosophers and Chinese philosophers have really known this for millennia. Every kind of political system has its flaws. And the United States system has very deep flaws. It's very corrupted, money-driven, plutocratic, very unequal, and it's produced a president that I think is not competent for the job and has resulted in that incompetence in the vulnerability of America to this pandemic. We've lost 100,000 lives, and lives continue to be lost, whereas China stopped the loss of life through very effective means. Not just China, also Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and others, but the U.S. did not. So I don't give our political system high points if we're not competent in this. I would also say China's political system has done an amazing job of economic development over the period roughly of the last 40 years. Perfect? No way. Heavily polluting, massive problems, some rising inequality. But from poverty to the current state of development is a success story of policy. It's not a failure story of policy. And when it comes to human rights, we all have our deep shortcomings. This is for sure. The United States has launched several wars. We have people suffering actually tremendous abuses of discrimination, incarceration, and so forth. And I think that China and the U.S. and many parts of the world have a lot to do to improve human rights. But China's political system is based on a different tradition. It's based on a tradition of 2,000 years of centralized administrative governance. That's not just about the Communist Party or a current dictatorship. That is a style of governance that really goes back to the Han Dynasty. This goes back to before the Common Era, in other words, to BC. And we should understand that's a different system. It's got a different philosophical base. Our philosophical base can be found in Aristotle and Christianity, and their philosophical base of governance is found far more in Confucius and in Mencius. But having said that, there is common ground for constructive, peaceful, mutually beneficial work in this world. And I think that it's important that China and the United States championed, indeed co-wrote, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Moral Charter of the United Nations, in 1948. Eleanor Roosevelt was the great progenitor of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but one of the great authors of it was a Chinese Confucian scholar, P.C. Chang, who in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights strove to show that the Western values and the Confucian values could be combined into a truly universal vision of human rights. So I would like us to build on what we share together as humanity rather than simply pointing fingers. And the worst part about pointing fingers is you forget about your own shortcomings. And my word, the United States has them massively in our politics right now. We are suffering a failure of politics, so we should fix our own act.
You know, I wanted to pull back just a little bit from China and ask you sort of you might call it a global north, global south question, because you identify environmental concerns as one of the main concerns of this current age of globalization. We've certainly seen, as we get this development that pulls people out of poverty, we also see things like loss of biodiversity and people eating more meat, which puts a lot of stress on the environment and fossil fuels and all that. But one thing I've heard, at least some people in developing countries say, is that it's kind of unfair and maybe even a little hypocritical for the rich countries from the global north to kind of lecture them about environmental stewardship when we were essentially doing the same things to get, to bootstrap our growth. And they're saying, well, we need our chance now. And I'm wondering, what you think about that argument. Should there be different standards for the developed and the developing world?
I don't think it is to any advantage of the developing world to follow our bad examples. Yes, we deforested massively. We polluted our air and soils. We did all sorts of things wrong. But what is the most important truth right now is we learned, God, that comes at a high cost. Millions of people dying of air pollution, even with COVID-19, higher mortality rates where air pollution and lung disease are higher. So I would say to developing countries, whether you want to point a finger, claim hypocrisy, and so on, it's not even to your advantage to follow the dirty path and then say, oh my God, we got to clean it up afterwards, but rather to take note that because of advances of technology, especially in the digital age, renewable energy like wind and solar power, the ability to do things far more efficiently because of mobile broadband, dematerialization of certain production, having telemedicine or distance education, things we're scrambling to do right now in the middle of this epidemic. The possibility of having electric vehicles that are clean, not the internal combustion engine polluting vehicles and the diesel engine polluting vehicles. There's a path now of development and environmental safety combined. That's the idea of sustainable development. That's the idea that I champion, that I study, that I write about, that is in the title of my professorship. I'm a professor of sustainable development at Columbia University. And sustainable development means you can do more than one thing at a time. You can have economic growth, but you can also be socially fair, and you can be environmentally sustainable. All three things simultaneously, rather than saying, don't bother me, I want to get rich. Yeah, we'll be more unequal, we'll be dirtier, but I want to get rich. It's not necessary to go that way. It's not desirable. It's not for human well-being, even of the laggard country trying to catch up. It's much better to say, I would like to live in a country that is prosperous. That means using the latest technologies. That is fair, meaning not divided between rich and poor. And that is environmentally sustainable, meaning we have water to grow food. We're not wrecking the climate. We're not killing ourselves by air pollution. We're not destroying the biodiversity that both gives us pleasure, that is part of our stewardship, but also that pollinates our food, for heaven's sake, that allows us to grow the food that we need to stay alive. So that's the notion that we should be aiming for all three objectives of economic prosperity, social justice, and environmental sustainability combined. We need to do that. But the better news than whether we need to do it or not is we can do it. We can do it feasibly. And there are paths for today's poor countries, many of which are in very sunny tropical places and could use solar energy as their bootstrap because they didn't have oil, they didn't have gas, they didn't have coal, but boy, did they have sunshine. This is the approach that we should be taking.
And, you mentioned those areas, and I haven't asked you yet a specific question about Africa. And of course, I know we're running a little short, but I have to ask you about Africa because I know how deep your concern is, especially for sub-Saharan Africa. And I got to admit, whenever I think about most of Africa, I end up feeling sort of overwhelmed and and hopeless. And maybe in part, I think, because I wonder maybe that there are certain cultural issues behind some of the issues, because I feel like even really well thought out attempts to kind of help bring Africa up, they're faced with this sort of massive corruption, just really poorly developed institutions, and big problems with things like transparency, rule of law, and property rights, and it just honestly feels sort of overwhelming to me, and I guess probably to a lot of people in the area of development. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how you even begin to deal with the problem that just seems so big and multifactored.
Well, I am very optimistic, actually, about those issues, because I don't really see those issues as having determined Africa's trajectory or holding back Africa at this point. The history of African development, as I show in the book, is that it has basically been very difficult for a long time, for centuries, for millennia. It has little to do with politics and a tremendous amount to do with physical geography. Africa is the tropical continent. There's massive, unfortunately, endemic disease, malaria, probably the most powerful hold on much of Africa, but also trypanosomiasis, African sleeping sickness, so-called, which prevented horses and cattle from occupying large parts of Africa, basically from time immemorial. There are parts of Africa where most domesticated farm animals could survive, but in the real tropical hold where these diseases are such a heavy burden, agriculture was impeded, human disease burdens were enormous, and what one sees is that populations tended to be sparse. Cities were never large. What are called historic empires of Africa were real, but not large compared to the Lucky Latitude empires. And this was Africa's condition for a very long time, not related to claims about politics or colonial rule, for that matter. Colonialism, imperial domination came in two parts. One, with the cruelty of the slave trade starting in the 16th century, especially after the opening of the Americas to European colonial settlement, and then to a significant extent based on African slaves brought to the Caribbean, to Brazil, to the American South, and so on. And then the physical presence of Europeans in Africa only starting really in the 1870s onward in large numbers, when Europe, starting with Britain, identified a way to protect against malaria, what became the quinine or quinine of the gin and tonic, the beverage of imperial domination of Africa. When quinine was identified as an anti-malarial, it became possible for Europe to overrun Africa and create a very cruel structure of imperial power. And that imperialism lasted until the 1950s to 1970s, with many wars of liberation needed to get the European imperial powers out. Well, by the 1970s, Africa was impoverished, though much more populous, but living its subsistence. And then comes this concept again of convergence. Now was the time for Africa to begin by spreading education, which the European imperial powers had never done. So the cruelty of imperialism was very great. The neglect of basic human needs by the British, the French, the Germans during their imperial period, the Portuguese, very, very cruel. And then we point fingers at Africans saying, how can you behave that way when it was Europe that was just despicably cruel for such a long period in Africa. Now, even into the last decades of the last century and the early years of this century, the burdens of disease remain very severe, and a new disease emerged, HIV/AIDS, the human immunodeficiency virus. And I spent many years working with African colleagues on helping to fight those diseases. I recommended a global fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, which took shape in 2001 and 2002 and continues operating till today with very beneficial effect. My experience is there are tremendously talented leaders and specialists throughout Africa, but the battle against poverty is a step-by-step battle. Just as we talk, I've been in discussions this very day with some of Africa's leaders on the COVID epidemic. And what the African Union has done has been to bring together in a very systematic manner leading public health officials, meetings of finance ministers and health ministers, specialized task forces, deployment of community health workers, deployment of new applications, and so on. Very well organized. A lot that we could learn from in the quality of this organization. And so far, and it's a big struggle, the burden of COVID-19 is less in Africa than it is in the United States right now. And I think there's a lot that we can learn by deploying community health workers and other systems that Africa has experience with, because it's been fighting Ebola and AIDS and malaria and so on for many, many years. So no, I don't think that this is fundamentally a matter of governance per se. I think it's a matter of poverty, physical geography, disease burdens, the challenges of development in the extreme tropics. But I also see a tremendous opportunity with the rise of solar energy, which gives a tremendous scope for new energy development in Africa, with the rise of digital technologies, which enable people even in remote villages to become online to get telemedicine, distance education, and so forth, e-payments, e-governance. In other words, using the digital technologies as a leapfrog technology. This is really the possibility for Africa now.
Well, that is definitely an optimistic look at things, and I think that would be a great place to end on this optimistic note. So, Jeffrey Sachs, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
It's been great to be with you, and thank you so much, and look forward to another opportunity together.
That's it for today's show. We hope you like what you heard. If you'd like a second full-length Politics Guys episode every single week, as opposed to just these occasional interviews, you can get that by becoming a Patreon supporter. Supporters also get ad-free versions of every episode, as well as other good stuff. To get the details and to become a supporter, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you can't afford to become a supporter, email me at mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get you full access to that second episode every single week. And if being a monthly supporter is too much of a commitment, but you still like to help us out occasionally, you can do that too through PayPal. You'll find a link on our website, politicsguys.com/support. And if you haven't already subscribed to the show, that is a big help, as well as leaving ratings and reviews, and especially sharing your favorite episodes on social media. That's a big deal to us. And if you've got a question, comment, correction, gripe, or whatever, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. For more great discussions, check out our Bipartisan Politics subreddit. You'll find the URL in the show notes. We've also got a Facebook page. That's facebook.com/politicsguys page. And we're on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope you'll join us.